Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. That's New Zealand Maori for 3 times welcome. I apologise for the delay, I'll try not to be too long, but this is a relatively long talk. I'll go straight into it. I'm David Trubridge, I'm from New Zealand, and normally this is what I do. I have a company, we make lighting out of bamboo plywood. It's all packed into small boxes and exported around the world as kit set, and you get the fun of making it, assembling it yourself. And this was a show we had in Frankfurt a couple of years ago. We go to trade shows around the world, and this is how we display them. We built this, what we call a tree, which we hang all our lights from. So we take everything over to the show and build it in situ there, and we don't have to truck big loads of equipment. But this talk is not about me, it's about Beauty Matters. It's a story of our relationship with the relationship between nature and humans and how beauty is formed in that gap. I like to hike. I spend a lot of time, whenever I do trips like this, I try and find time for me to go hiking. This was one trip I did in the Grand Canyon a few years ago, on the northeast side of the canyon, looking out over the painted desert. I walked through the forest and I came out onto this sort of cliff, and I saw this rock in the distance there, and it was sort of late in the day, and I thought, maybe, and I came close to it, and I found this incredible ledge jutting out over the abyss. And that's where I slept the night. And I watched the sun go down and the shadows creep out from underneath, from behind me, and they came up, they crept up the sides of the canyon, slowly climbed up onto the top and spread out over the desert, and it was dark. And I watched the stars move across the sky. The rock was quite hard, and I woke up a few times and turned over, and each time I looked up, and the stars had moved. And in the morning, the sun rose right behind Navajo Mountain, which is sacred to the Navajo. It's never been climbed. It's perfectly, if it was a bit brighter, you'd see there's another mountain in front, perfectly lined up. And this was the summer solstice. And this is what you get when you go out into the bush on your own, into the space, wild spaces. And I sat there thinking, what is this thing that we call beauty? Where does it come from? Why is it important to us? Why does it appear in all cultures around the world? And so this is about beauty. I went to a conference in New Zealand in the 90s about art. And the theme of the conference was that art is not about beauty. Beauty is a distraction from what art is about. Art is political. There was an intellectual from the Philippines who gave a long talk about how art should be political, how art should talk about the sex industry in the Philippines, which was terrible, and this was a moral obligation we had to talk about these things. Other artists have turned art into business, big business. They made lots of money out of it, either galleries, dealers, or artists themselves. But it takes more than a Filipino intellectual or a Jeff Koons to deny 50,000 years of human history when art has always been about beauty in some form or other. I used to talk about environmental issues in the early days, about how we had to redesign everything because all our systems were failing us. Our banking systems, our trade systems, our political systems, our economic systems, they're all essentially failing us in this overpopulated world with too much stuff. But now I've come to realize there's something more fundamental than these systems we've built. It's what has built them that's the problem. The problem is in our brain up here. We're programmed to think in a certain way, and that's directing us in the way we're going. So we need to think about the brain, the human brain. How does it work? How is that affecting us today? And the key thing about the human brain is that there are 2 of them. 2 hemispheres. Now why would, and that's not just humans, all creatures have 2 hemispheres. So why would we go to this incredible expenditure of energy and effort to have 2 brains? And this is a really important thing because we cannot, it's developed because we need 2 forms of attention. So think of this bird sitting on the gravel here. It needs to look at the gravel with a focused attention and know whether what it's seeing is a stone or a seed. But at the same time, it needs to be very aware what's happening around it, because it might be lunch for somebody up there who's bigger than it. So two quite separate forms of attention, focused and connected. And you can't do those with one brain, so we've developed two brains, one for doing one for doing the other. And how that relates to us in our culture today, I'll illustrate that with a story about sheep, because I'm from New Zealand. But that's a sheep from Iceland. There's a guy from Iceland here, I don't know if he's here today, but I was talking with him last night. I love Iceland. Sheep used to roam like these moors of Iceland, very open, no plenty of space, not many of them, all the grass in the world they needed. They wandered together as they wished. But as they became more populated, and now we're back in New Zealand, they made tracks across the landscape, and they'd walk along, grazing the grass, one behind the other, following the track in front of them, until they came to a fence. Now a sheep only knows one thing when it gets to a fence: keep on pushing. And the more it pushes, the more it gets stuck. And if it only had the sense to realise there's a hole just over here, if you could back off, you could go through that hole. Or even, you don't even need to go across the fence, because what you've got on this side is actually better anyway. That is us in our world today. We have got this programmed brain which is taking us along this path which we've seen. We know what's the problem. We know we're causing all these problems of pollution and global warming and everything else, and yet we still continue along the same course. So what's happening up in this brain here that's making us do this? When, if we only had the common sense to look around us and stand back and see we don't need to go through that fence at all. And this is really well described by Ian McGilchrist in this amazing book called The Master and His Emissary. McGilchrist is a neuroscientist and also a writer. And he's talked about this, what he calls the divided brain, and how that's affecting our society today. And he describes these two hemispheres that we've got in this way. The right, as I've said, is connected, it looks out in the world in all spherical ways, whereas the left thinks in a linear way. The right sees things as implicit and the left as explicit. The right is intuitive, whereas the left is rational and scientific. The right sees things in context, the left takes things out of context. The right understands in betweenness, the left sees things as abstract and disembodied. The right understands metaphor, the story of the sheep I told you. You understood through your right hemisphere. Your left only heard a story about a sheep and made no connection. All your empathy is in the right, whereas the left is self-referential. The right likes things uncertain, not fully known. The left likes certainty, clarity, and the familiar. And our brains have developed to work in a three-part step, 3 steps in a row. So imagine early humans living out on the steppes of Africa. Like the bird, we'd be grazing, looking for food in front of us, and we'd be connected with our right hemisphere to the world around us. A movement happens over here on the periphery. We home in on that movement and take what we see out of context, hand it over to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere analyses it, looks at it, said, yes, this is a threat, but then we put that back into context and we say, no, we don't need to worry about it over there. This 3-part process, connection, analysis, context, is how all brains work. But the problem that McGilchrist points out is that today the left hemisphere is not handing back to the right. It's not putting things back into context. The left thinks it knows all the answers. The left has become what he calls a self-referential hall of mirrors, that within its own limited world thinks it knows the answers, but it's no longer connected to the world around it, so it doesn't know that actually it's wrong. That's why we're a sheep in the fence. That's why our brains are programmed so much to emphasis on the left hemisphere that we're in this problem today. I'm not saying that either one is better than the other. They're both very powerful tools, but we have to not rely so much on the left and use them both together. Now, I'm going to take a little sideways step and you'll see where this is going in a minute. Artists, people have asked me, what are you? Are you a designer, craftsman, an artist? You do all these things. What actually do you call yourself? What do you make? Now, I don't separate art and design and craft as being separate things. There's no point in that line, in that continuum of colour where you can put a line and say it's blue on one side and red on the other. There's a whole continuum of things. As a designer, I could design a carburetor. That's a machine process. It's a very left-brain process. Or I could create an artistic work of design. A chair which is very elaborate and expressive. It's still a design piece, but it's moved along the scale towards art, and so on. I see these as verbs, not nouns. They're processes, not things or people. So as a designer, if I just said I'm a designer, I don't do the art stuff, or I don't do the making stuff, I just do design. Where do you get your designs from? How do you generate ideas? That's the creative process. You need the art process to do that. In New Zealand, we have a word called taranga waiwai, the Maori for my place to stand. So an artist has to find their taranga waiwai, find that place, that point in their heart, their spirit, where their spirit lies, and then learn to speak from that place with their own voice and have confidence that their voice has something to offer, and then develop a vocabulary with which to express what they're saying from that place. Now, as a designer, you have a vocabulary with which to build. You have the building blocks you can put together to create a design. You put these things into a structure of a poem or a chair or whatever you're creating. And as a craftsman, person, you know how to make them. Your skills of making enable you to create that thing. You cannot design what you can't make. You have to understand the making process if you're going to design something. Otherwise, how you know that joint's going to be strong enough? You need to know the material. So this is not a sort of separated thing. So this is a linear process which I think we should all work through. If we don't work through the whole creative process, if we say we're only an artist or only a designer or only a craftsperson, then we're not going to fulfill our potential as a creative person. And I think that's really well described by Michelangelo in his work in the Sistine Chapel. He was an artist in how he told these amazing stories about our culture. He changed our attitude towards our bodies. And as a designer, he laid out those stories which he was telling in a composition which perfectly expressed what he's trying to say. That really powerful moment when God's spark of energy is about to jump across to Adam. The composition of that painting perfectly expresses the story he's telling. And then he was a consummate craftsman. He mixed all his own colours, his pigments. He prepared the grounds on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel so that those colours are still there, bright today, hundreds of years later after he put them on. The perfect balance of all three. So it's really important as a designer that you work through the whole creative process, starting from the art part at the beginning, the full creative process. Now you're beginning to see the connection. Because I had this eureka moment just not that long ago, and I suddenly realised that three-part process that our brains are programmed to do, left, right, left, right, is exactly this creative process. We lean back, we open up, we think expansively, creatively as an artist. We get some ideas, we lean forward and we focus and we build a structure with those ideas. And with our craft, our haptic embedded knowledge in our bodies, of our understanding of making, we then apply that and make it. The three-part process, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right. So if we're doing that creative process correctly, we're using the full potential of our brain. If we don't, we're not. You could also call that, in the sort of Western Trinity, the spirit, the mind, and the body. So now that explains the difference between the new and the novel. The genuinely new is like a Brancusi sculpture which changed the course of design and art for the whole of the 20th century. He stripped away all the surface clutter of sculpture and dived back in and found the pure essence at the heart of a sculpture. The surface did not matter anymore. It was the form that expressed that feeling of the sculpture that was what he found. He was a craftsman. He came from Romania. He carved wood in his younger days. So he understood materials as well. So he was like Michelangelo, that perfect mix of artist, designer and craftsman. That is the stunningly, amazingly new, out of nowhere, that no one could have seen coming. It was like a lighthouse at the beginning of the 20th century, pointing the way for design and art for the rest of that century. Whereas the novel is a clever idea. Oh, I know. I'll put a tractor seat on a tool handle and I'll call it a chair. Aren't I clever? This is left brain thinking. This is because the creator has no ideas beyond what's already in their brain. They can't reach out and connect and come up with something amazingly new, so they just take this ironic, witty, clever juxtaposition of existing stuff and rearrange it and call it a new design. Now I know this is a well-known Italian designer, but to me it is still a gimmick. It is clever design, whereas the Brancusi is beautiful design. The other thing is that the Brancusi cannot be willed. You cannot will true creativity. You listen to any artist, any creative person about how they find their creativity, and they'll all say, you cannot will it. You have to know the conditions in which it happens, create those conditions and allow it to happen. Wait for the muse to come to you, as the poets say. Bob Dylan talks about this perfectly. He couldn't will his poetry, he just knew the conditions in which it happened and he set them up. Whereas the tractor seat is an act of will. It is an intellectual idea, which hardly even needs making. Once you've had the idea, almost why bother making it? It doesn't require material form. It is inauthentic, whereas the sculpture requires the material in which to explore it, to find that form, and is totally authentic. So coming back to art and our idea of beauty in our culture, where did it come from? Let's go back through history and follow the development of human over the centuries. Way, way, way back, humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa. We lived as different forms of primate for several million years in the forest. And during that time, the forest was a surrounding greenness. It was just we were immersed, totally subjectively immersed in this greenness of forest. There was no sense of time. Time was cyclical, or the sense of time was cyclical. It was day and night, seasons, if there were any seasons, and yearly time going round and round. That several million years of our existence in the forest must have had an effect on us. Because how can that, we've been Homo sapiens for only 100, 200,000 years, but that was several million years. So in that time, we became so attuned to the forest that I think that we've still got that connection within us, even if we don't know it. It's been proven that people who can see trees during their days, in their workplace, around their homes, are more community-minded and more generous. And people who can't are more self-centered, more concerned with their own fame and their own fortune. So trees change us. It's been proven that if you're recovering from serious trauma, you'll be prescribed to go walking in the forest 20 minutes a day, and it's been proven you will get better faster. Trees psychologically help us and they cure us. I'm sure we've all got screensavers on our computers or pictures in our homes of trees or mountain lakes or tropical islands or icebergs or whatever. I'm sure that's subliminally that's our connection back to that time when we lived in the forest, that important time. Then two things happened in our development. We developed language and we developed tool use. Both happened in the left hemisphere, in the same part of the left hemisphere at about the same time. They were developments of manipulation and control. Controlling words so we could control the environment around us. Instead of being enveloped by this greenness, we now saw a tree. That was a tree, and this is me. Now I'm separate because I've named it. In the same way with tools, these became ways in which we could manipulate the environment to our advantage by making things, by carving things, by using the tools. And in this new world, eventually, as time evolved, time was no longer cyclical, but time starts to become linear and straight. We changed the course of our evolution through our thinking, through our ability to use language and to use tools. We started to control the environment around us rather than be controlled by it, like most other creatures. We're unique in the history of the universe or the world of a species that changed its own direction. But these two things were the first two wedges that started to split us and separate us from nature. So with these tools of language and tool use, we were now able to develop and expand out of Africa as a species and spread around the world. These dates are probably not quite correct, but the initial migration out of Africa happened 100,000 years ago, but they were all destroyed in a massive eruption from Indonesia, which wiped out the whole of life in the Middle East. And the humans went back into what was left in Africa. There was only maybe about 10,000 humans left at that point, and that's what we call a gene gate. And all the humans on Earth share almost identical genes. There is more gene variety in neighbouring tribes of chimpanzees in the African forest than there is between the whole human race. Then we evolved, we moved out a second time, about 60,000 years ago, and split into two courses. One went left up into Europe, and one went right down the coast of Asia, ended up in New Guinea and Australia about 55,000 years ago, before moving on up the coast of Asia. When those first humans arrived in Europe, it was a time of relatively benign weather conditions. But very quickly, after about 5,000 years, the weather started to get quite nasty. We had, over the next 20, 30,000 years, it was a very rapidly changing cycle of warm and cold, warm and cold. And suddenly, survival was a serious problem for these first humans in Europe. It was cold and bitter, and it was hard to get animals. And yet, at that moment, we started making art. Not when we had plenty, but when we were struggling to survive. And anthropologists reckon that it was art that brought us together socially as a community. It made us feel stronger by sharing ideas through our paintings, through our rituals, through our singing, whatever. It was a binding of the community which made the community stronger to survive the cold. These are some of the first cave paintings from Chauvet in the south of France. Probably about 30,000 years ago these were painted or drawn. Now if I said to you, from memory, in the dark, in a cave, underground, and there's probably cave bears lurking down there, they'll eat you. Draw a lion. Could you do that, like this? I certainly couldn't. Look how beautifully they've even made it three-dimensional. They've drawn with a charcoal stick, and they've smudged with the finger the inside to create a sort of form of the lion's head to make it almost look three-dimensional. They even sometimes drew around rocks to even make it look three-dimensional, so that when the flickering candlelight moved across it, it looked real. They had no notebook, no camera. This was done from memory. This was carved 13,000 years ago, also from the south of France, the swimming reindeer of Montreuil. Anthropologists have recreated this carving from a similar bone. This was a mammoth tusk. Today we have different bones. It took 400 hours to make. Now, again, in a time of hard survival, I think it's amazing that these people were prepared to support an artist for 10 weeks, maybe, to make something like this. It shows how important art must have been to them, even when they were struggling to survive. But why did they carve animals? Almost every single drawing or carving was of animals. And this is fascinating. I think I can this is more of a personal answer to this, from my own personal experience. I was hiking in the forests in Utah. This photograph was actually taken in Colorado, but I was hiking in Utah. And it was at the end of the day, and I'd been walking all day, and I was off trail, I was on my own. I like to sort of just sleep out under the trees and enjoy the space, enjoy the silence. And I had my dinner, I was sitting leaning against a tree, drinking a cup of tea. It was quiet and peaceful, and the sun was just going down, the wind had stopped. Suddenly in the silence, there was this almighty crashing and bashing all around me, and the noise and all the hackles up my back of my neck. What's that? What's that? And there was one of these mule deer just standing in the clearing, just a few yards away from me. And I just froze and hissed, and we had this incredible eye contact. It seemed to go on for ages. And she froze, and we were just looking at each other. And then eventually she moved off with high steps through the brush, came back, and then quietly vanished. Now, because of the adrenaline that was powering through my body at that time, I remember everything about that animal. It was an intense experience that was seared in my mind, and of course I could draw it much more easily because of that. But also because of that, because like now today, here I'm telling you about it, it was a story I wanted to share with other people. So I think this is where the first art came from. It was this connection that humans had with other creatures, this amazing eye contact in the wild, that when they had this experience with creatures, they wanted to understand it and also share it. Hence was born art. I think what was happening in this too was something else, that the artists were sensing something about the animals which we had lost. The animals knew when to migrate. They knew what to eat without being poisoned. We had doubt. Can I eat that? Or is that going to make me sick? I don't know. Do we migrate now, or do we wait a little bit for the winter to come on and catch more food while we can here? I don't know, but the animals know. So they had this instinct that we were now separate from the animal kingdom in a certain way. And that maybe created a trauma. Maybe that forced them to go back down into the caves and work out this trauma in the womb of the earth to understand this relationship which we have with the animals and with nature around us. There's an anthropologist and poet, Clayton Eshelman, who wrote a book called Juniper Fuse, and in it he coined the phrase postcards of nostalgia for these paintings. And I think that sums it up lovely. I've done 28, I've got 40. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So art tried to reconnect and access this instinctive knowledge. And I think this is the point, this is the crucial point where beauty arrived. Because that feeling which these animals had for this, for nature, the feeling that these artists had for nature was a sort of sense of yearning or need to connect for something which we felt we'd lost. And that's what beauty is. Beauty is a sort of yearning for something which we feel, that we see around us, that we want to express in some form through our art. So I think that in this crucial moment, the idea, the concept of beauty was formed in that space between us and these animals. And because we are social and because we like to communicate, we developed a way of telling that to other people around us, and hence was born art. So from there on, humans settled down into this hunter-gatherer existence for the next 30,000, 40,000 years. And they found a sort of new relationship with nature, which they hadn't had before, that of the hunter-gatherer. And we know a little bit about these people, because there are still hunter-gatherer peoples living on Earth today, and we can extrapolate. Pretty similar, we think, what we see around us today and what they had. And the thing about the hunter-gatherer is that, for a start, they didn't have a concept of nature as an overall thing. They just had relationship with individual things. And it was not an adversary. They were part of it in a different sort of a way. And they had this feeling that you had to become the animal to hunt it. They had no big rifles, they had to get really close to the animals. So they had to watch them and stalk them for hours and hours and days, understand their habits. And so they could feel and be like the animal. The Inuit say that you can only carve a walrus if you have eaten the walrus, you've hunted it. The animals to them were their food, they ate them, they put their skins on, they kept them warm, they used their bones for building things. So they had this relationship, and they had this feeling that you had to respect the animals, because if you don't respect them, they won't come to you and you won't catch them. This sort of balance was based around respect. Nature provides food for everybody, and it will look after us if we look after it. A mutual respect. Hunter-gatherers lived in this balance for many hundreds and thousands of years. And that's nature's way. They knew no other way of doing things. There was no excess in nature. Everything lived in a tight balance. They only had enough food for the day. They would always find enough tomorrow. They didn't need to hoard it. They had no kings. They had no possessions. They had no leaders. They were egalitarian. And they moved as they needed to around the world, around their territories. They controlled the population for their mobility in order to survive. They stored fat. They could go for many days, sometimes weeks without eating, because they could control their storage of fat. And they were healthy. They built no monuments, left no footprint, left no mark on nature. Then we started farming about 10,000 years ago, when the Neolithic period started. Now we're exploiting nature for our own use. Like our tools, it's a form of manipulation of the environment around us for ourselves. We controlled animals into paddocks, we planted crops in fields, and we controlled it. And with that greater proximity to animals came disease. We picked up diseases from animals, and then because we all lived in much closer proximity in villages and towns and cities, we passed those diseases on to each other. Skeletons of early Neolithic peoples were much smaller and less healthy than the previous hunter-gatherer skeletons that had been found in the deserts. Farming is the next wedge that separates us from nature, which leads to this, what I find absolutely ghastly rendition of nature, that the roly-poly, happily cross-eyed pig offering you its flesh on a plate for you to eat. Or because our animals which we keep are precious to us, those other wild animals which eat ours become the ogres, the baddies, the wolf and the shark. It's okay to go out and shoot and hunt them because they eat our precious animals which we've kept. I find this the ultimate degradation of nature. And it has led to the globalization of food, where nobody has any connection anymore to the food that they eat. It could eat one small meal or one small packet of food, could have ingredients that come from all over the world. We don't know where, we don't know how it was grown, we don't know who grew it, we don't know what's gone into it. We're totally disconnected from the food that we eat. And because now we're dependent on the weather for our crops and our animals to survive, we start to look up at the sky where the weather comes from, and we need to propitiate those gods which control the sky to make sure we don't have a crop failure, because we will starve now if we lose our crops. So along with farming came religion, the next wedge that separates us from nature. Genesis talks about Cain and Abel. Cain was the farmer. What about the 100,000 years of human history before farming came along, when we were hunter-gatherers? It's not mentioned. I think it's time that we got over this. We've moved on from this narrative of Genesis, the idea that we have dominion over the animals and the birds and the beasts and everything that creepeth on this earth. We've failed in that dominion. We've killed them, we've destroyed them, we've polluted the earth. It's time that we realize we do not have dominion over nature. We are a part of it, and it is a part of us. And more recent history, it's quite interesting. McGilchrist talks about this in his book, to trace the cycles of culture and how they've changed over the centuries. The early Greeks were a time of right hemisphere of art. The late Greeks were left hemisphere of philosophy. The Renaissance was the flowering of the right hemisphere of the arts, and the left came afterwards with the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Then followed the Romantics, and the final triumph of the left, today's Industrial Revolution and modernism. And you can depict these things. The Cartesian grid, developed by Descartes as the left hemisphere way of seeing the world, whereas the right, in the Romantic period, sees nature as being bigger than us. The trees and the clouds are big, the humans and the bridge and the city are tiny in comparison. The Industrial Revolution set a new criteria. Beauty and craft were taken out of the world and replaced by manufacturing. The refined eye of the craftsman was replaced by engineering. The feel of the craftsman of the right brain was replaced by the left brain work of the engineer and the accountant. This boat is a metaphor for us in our time today. This incredibly inefficient machine punching its way through the forest, through the ocean, against the trade winds, incredibly inefficient, with turbulence coming off the propellers, using cheap fossil fuels to bring goods all around the world. Industrial revolution manufacturing is the last wedge that separates us from nature. So while beauty was taken away from everyday life, it was taken over by the philosophers, and it was become a philosophy in its own right. Schopenhauer talked about beauty, contemplating the perfection of form without any worldly agenda. Any intrusion of utility or politics would ruin the point of beauty. So beauty was now put on a plinth in an art gallery. We paced around it as connoisseurs and looked at it from a distance, but it wasn't part of our lives in the same way. Meanwhile, outside, daily life got on without it, churning out more and more stuff. The cheaper it gets, the more the economy likes it. But we've made art for the 50,000 years that Homo sapiens has been around. It's always been about beauty, whether it's in the jungles of Central America, Middle East, deserts, or the polar ice caps. Everything has been about beauty. It's more than nostalgia. It's the search for an essence, the utility of life, the vitality of life, which we know we're not quite connected to, which we're trying to find. Like Cézanne trying to capture Mont Saint-Victoire again and again and again in all the paintings that he did so many times. Or the sculptor trying to catch the beauty of the human form, or the cathedral builder, the majesty of the forest, or the composer, the song of the birds, or the Islamic mosaic artist, the patterns of nature. In other parts of the world, there isn't that same reference to the grid and beauty. In the Pacific Island, the Pacific Island peoples have a different way of connecting to the world around them. If you fly across the Pacific Midwest here, you see the 1 mile square blocks of farmland, the smaller blocks of the suburbs, and the smaller blocks of downtown. It's all gridded. Everything about our world is gridded. Our positions, our longitude and latitude is numbers on the phone. We know where we are from the grid. The Polynesians knew where they were spherically by being connected to the universe, and they colonized the whole Pacific Ocean without any understanding of grid, through the spherical connection to the world around them and the knowledge of the stars. The Maori have a word for beauty called atahua. And for them, beauty does not lie intrinsically in a person or an object. It lies in a relationship between two things. As a creator, you make something beautiful with your love and care that you put into the making of it. And then when someone owns and uses that object, it makes them beautiful in return. It's a two-way process, and I love that. For the Polynesians and their boats, beauty was not an indulgence, it was a necessity to create the perfect form for the sail and the hull to slip easily and well through the water. Their design knowledge is the result of a lifetime's sailing on the water, understanding the flow of the water, the carving of the wood, the wind across the sails. They're all in that essence in the work that they're doing. And probably they understand the forms of nature around them, which are also perfect in their own way, and they develop those forms. But in nature, things aren't beautiful. They're just art, that's just a sailfish. We call it beautiful. But the Polynesians took it even further, and somehow some of the things they built expressed their incredible joy and exuberance of sailing over the oceans, and how they've not conquered but understood and shared the essence of the oceans in the things that they make. Schopenhauer's utility can't be beautiful. I mean, here's a beautiful canoe. According to Schopenhauer, it can't be beautiful because it's useful, or maybe because it's also made by a primitive. But I think that's the most incredibly beautiful thing I've seen. And the same care and reverence is used in other societies, in other things that they make as well. So why today, with all our affluence and all our wealth and all our knowledge, do we make things that are so ugly as these boats and these houses? We care about beauty. Or conversely, if something is not beautiful, we don't care about it. So we chuck it away. If somebody makes a beautiful cup, you keep it. This was made in South Africa, the project there, and the people who made it, it was part of the 10,000 things which were made, and they're all put into a compound in the where Nelson Mandela used to exercise every day when he was imprisoned there. And that was his number, his prison number, 46664. So those are all those cups. And when they were wet, they were squeezed, and I squoze a couple, and then they were given and sold to people. And then about 3 years later, when I was in South Africa, about 3 years later, those two cups arrived in my studio in New Zealand through 3 degrees of separation. People knew someone who was going to New Zealand, and then I got it. And it's such a beautiful, lovely cup with this most amazing story. There's no way I want to destroy it or throw it away. Beauty, we need beauty because we care about beauty. We care about things, and we'll keep them, and they'll last, and we won't throw them away. Beauty begins or turn it around the other way, ugliness begins in the home. If we have ugly crap in our home, if we accept it in our homes, like this junk food and stuff, we'll accept it in the world around us, we'll accept it in advertising hoardings, ugly buildings, and we'll accept it in the desecration of nature and the forests around us. It's not enough to create eco-efficiency and wooden buildings and bamboo buildings just because they're eco-efficient. They have to be beautiful as well, because then we'll care for them and they'll look after them. But also, they'll make us more beautiful. So we go up like this. But if we make ugly things which we don't feel or care about, we go down like this. I want to take beauty away from the design tribe, the style tribe, where beauty can only be bought and paid for if you've got enough money. Beauty is in every day in the world around us, and it's equally beautiful and valuable if you don't pay for it. If Paleolithic cavemen and traditional makers knew that beauty mattered so much, why today, with all our sophistication, can we be so stupid as not to realise that as well? Beauty is a fundamental expression of our humanity and of who we are. If we deny beauty, we deny our humanity. Thank you.